Thank you all for joining us for this London Art Week and Art Loss Register panel. The subject is the life of a collection managing today for tomorrow. We at the ALR are delighted to be a cultural partner of London Art Week, Law Digital. And as anyone who's been going through the viewing rooms or tuned into some of the other panels and talks, or even managed to make it to the actual galleries, it's been a fantastic edition of London Art Week. It's also been a fascinating opportunity to expand London Art Week to a more global exhibitor list and a larger network of attendees than ever. Reflecting Law's exhibitors and collectors, and within that international context, we thought it would be interesting to examine some of the practical ways that collectors, dealers like the London Art Week exhibitors, and other third parties work together to draw the most out of a collection and ultimately to shape its legacy. After all, many similar previous talks and panels hosted by London Art Week have discussed the legacy and reputation of famous historic collections. But we hope to cover some of the practical aspects and tools available for collectors to make the most of their objects. We're therefore delighted to have represented on this panel a point of view from collectors, from the trade, and from the due diligence aspects of the management and research of collections. We're particularly focusing on the way that provenance research and due diligence contribute not only to mitigating risks, but perhaps more attractively, how they can have a positive, significant effect on both the art historical and financial values of objects and collections. As I say, we're very grateful to the panelists for their insights, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tom Marks, who most of you know well from Apollo Magazine, another partner of London Art Week, who's kindly agreed to moderate the panel. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Will. And let me say good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel today. Let me give you a sense of how it's going to work over the next hour. I'm going to introduce the speakers. We will have a discussion for most of the hour, but I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end of the event where we can take questions. If you want to ask any questions of our panelists about the life of a collection, about collection management, about how provenance research contributes to the continuation and future of a collection, then if you leave a message in the chat box, which I believe is open at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try and address some of the questions in the last 10 minutes. So first of all, let me introduce our four panelists. We have Amelie Ebbinghaus with us. Amelie is a director at the Art Loss Register, and she manages the provenance research team and the German-speaking clients. She trained as a lawyer in Germany and worked in intellectual property litigation. So we have one of two partly legal perspectives on the panel, and as we think about due diligence. Mireille Mosler has 30 years of experience as a dealer in old masters and 19th century and contemporary art. She founded Mireille Mosler Limited in 1999, and she has placed works in numerous great international collections, including the Met, the Getty Museum in LA, the National Gallery in Washington, and the Ashmolean in Oxford. Petra Warrington is a solicitor with Hunter's Law LLP. She specializes in art and cultural property law. Her work includes resolving issues of title, provenance, and authenticity, as well as thinking about acquisitions, loans, and cross-border acquisitions of art and movement of art. And Christian Levette is a well-known collector. He has been collecting for many years, and in 2011 formed, as many of you will know, I'm sure, the Mougins Museum the Musée d'Art Classique de Mougins, Museum of Classical Art of Mougins, to house his collection of antiquities and works that reflect on the classical period. He is a well-known philanthropist, has supported many projects, and his current engagement includes being a member of the Arms and Armour Committee at the Met and a member of the Visitors Board at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to kick off. I've asked all of you to select one image or a couple of images that somehow reflect on this subject of the life of a collection beyond the simple buying and selling. And I'm going to try to share my screen now. Just bear with me for 1 second. And I think we're up and running now. So I'm going to start, they're all in alphabetical order. So let's start. Amelie, will you tell me why you've chosen this slide?
Thank you, Tom. So good evening, everyone. This beautiful Flowers to Life by Lois Corinth ended up on my desk at the Artless Register a few years ago in terms of the research that we do for works that come up as part of a transaction. And this was one of the works that turned out to actually have been looted by the Nazis. It was actually part of the collection of a Jewish collector from Berlin called Max Matthäus, who fled to the Netherlands, and unfortunately, when the Netherlands got occupied, ended up in Sobibor concentration camp, and the work was taken from the family's possession. It also later ended up in the collection of Wolfgang Gurlitt, who was part of the rather notorious Gurlitt family, as I'm sure you all will know their names. Now, this painting was actually subject to a restitution settlement. So all parties, the current owners and the former owners, made some concessions and a compromise was reached, and it was sold openly with that restitution agreement and with the story being brought back to the work. And actually the astonishing thing was that it sold in auction for more than 3 times its estimate. And I thought this would be an interesting thing to kick off with, to show that a good provenance and a sort of restituted work is a good provenance, is actually something that can really contribute to the value of a work, and it can also make it more interesting for some collectors who are especially concerned about provenance, like, for example, museums. And that's something we see in our work every day now, that particularly museums and larger collections have more and more sensitivity towards this issue of potential gaps in the provenance.
Well, that certainly raises some things that we'll come back to, particularly some of the benefits of doing your own provenance research. I'm also interested in, perhaps, dare I say it, the rather sort of bittersweet desire for some people perhaps to pick up provenances which might have almost a tragic story in some cases to them. Chris, let's move on to your slides here.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay, Tom?
I can.
Excellent. So I thought, sticking with the sort of the provenance area, I thought I'd sort of start with the bad and then go to the good. So so around sort of 2 to 3 years ago, we got a call at the Mougins Museum because there was a court case coming up in Spain in the following year, in 2018, where 2 Spanish chaps were being tried for looting a particular area in Spain in the late 80s and early 90s. And they were going to trial for looting something like 3,000 objects from an area near Zaragoza. 17 of those objects were Celto-Iberian and 4th century BC helmets. And I'd bought 8 of those quite innocently between 2008 and 2012. 6 of them at auction in Germany in 2008 and 2009. And my curator was asked to come and give evidence as to where we bought them. And we bought them or I'd bought them at public auction, or 6 of them at public auction. and another 2 actually from dealers that had sort of shown them widely. So one I'd sold on, which I've now bought back, which is going back to Spain, but they were interested in the 7, which were in the museum at the time. And before the trial even took place, it was clear that these helmets had come from this particular site. So before the Spanish even made the restitution claim, I thought that I would quite simply volunteer them back. I thought that would be that. I mean, they knew that I bought them publicly and in good faith, so there wasn't any sort of ramifications for us legally. They were so ecstatic that I sort of handed them back without a fight, without a charge, without asking any money for them. That UNESCO got involved. They were also ecstatic about this particular situation, because normally if a country even goes to the point of making a claim, there's normally some kind of international legal issue, and cultural ministers get involved, and there's lots of costs involved in that. So UNESCO wants to hold this up as sort of a great example of a collector sort of being honest and saying, here you go, here's your cultural heritage back, and I'll worry about getting the money back from the people that I bought them off. So then they invited me to give a speech at the UNESCO office in Paris last December. I handed the helmets back. In between times, the 2 looters have been given 3 and 6 years in prison in Spain in 2018. And the Spanish Air Force came and took the 7 helmets that I had then, that had been in the Museum, and flew them back to Spain. And the 8th helmet, which I bought, goes back later this year. So it was a success story for Spain. It's a success story for culture. But it very much demonstrates the pitfalls of collecting antiquities. And these helmets were published in the 1990s. They came from a famous collection that was put together in the 1980s. But the provenance was non-existent before the 1980s, and that was the pitfall. And these have been looted back then and belonged in Spain. So that's my sort of slide number 1. And then I've got a slide number 2 here, which is a more positive story of provenance. So as Tom said, I collect antiquities, have a major collection of antiquities that are all pretty much in the Museum, interspersed with artworks with classical themes. But aside from that, I have a number of other collections. The last few years, I've been collecting female abstract artists and artists like Helen Frankenthaler, Joe Mitchell, Lee Krasner, Elaine de Kooning, and the major other kind of, actually all the way from sort of the 1930s all the way through to today. This picture's by Grace Hartigan, another one of what you might call the 9th Street Women, following the famous book that was written by Mary Gabriel 2 years ago, which is now being made into a TV series, I believe, with Christian Bale playing Jackson Pollock. So this was painted in 1951, and it's called Cedar Bar. And which is a great title for this picture, because the Cedar Bar in downtown New York was where all the major artists at the time were hanging out. People like Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, Franz Klein, Robert Motherwell, etc. all used to go to this bar, and it was a sort of a melting pot of artists, poets, actors, that kind of thing. So a great title. The one problem with it was that Grace Hartigan wrote a series of diaries from 1951 to 1955, which are published, and you can buy them on Amazon, where she talks about pretty much all the paintings that she painted during those 4 years. And Cedar Bar, 1951, was not in there. So knowing that she actually changed the name of her pictures quite often, I thought I'd take a look at the 1951 part of the diaries and see if anything in there matched this Cedar Bar picture. And the first painting she talks about in 1951 is a painting called Aries, and she talks about it on and off for a further 9 pages. So the first thing I'm trying to do here is say to myself, well, and I was planning to do this for a whole bunch of pictures that she painted in 1951, so I thought, could this be Aries? And then when you look at it, you actually see a ram in the sort of bottom quarter of the picture, the white ram going from left to right. And in the far left-hand corner, you can see the black horns and the black face of a ram. And then just to the right of the horn, you can see a large R in grey, followed by an A and a very large M in grey in the bottom right-hand side of the picture. So it even says Ram on it, Aries, the Ram, being the zodiac sign. Then you see a black V about just over halfway up on the right-hand side, slightly painted over in red. And that black V written that way is the Aries sign in the zodiac. Then you've got a kind of yellow pentacle, which is also associated with the zodiac behind the red. So then I'm looking through the pages. She's talking about this Aries picture and the reds and the yellows in it. And then on the 9th page, she says, actually, I don't like the idea of calling it a zodiac sign. I'm going to change the name, but she doesn't say what to. So here we are. This is clearly Aries. It says Ram on it. It's the Ram, etc., etc. And so that sort of completed the provenance and makes it now, a published picture, and therefore even more interesting than it was before.
So I certainly want to pick up a little later on this idea that perhaps it's an overstated phrase, but that for the true collector, the collection might have a life of its own, that is there for the perhaps the collector hasn't anticipated, but that part of the joy of the collection might be provenance moving in either of these directions or other types of discovery. But for now, I'm going to move on to an image that Mireille has selected.
Yes, this is one of the rare occasions. It's a work by Gustave Moreau from 1896, but the full provenance is entirely documented, including that the artist brought the drawing when it was finished to Charles Efrusy, that most people will know from the hair with the amber eyes, who delivered it then to Comtesse Grefful, who was in Paris one of the more prominent collectors and salon owners at the time, and a real muse to many artists. From there, Comtesse Grefful's husband, a Belgian banker, died in 1932. And from then on, she's always faced with financial difficulties, and does sell art from her collection. And this ends up with the Wildensteins. And unfortunately for them, at the beginning of World War II, the drawing gets confiscated by the Germans. It gets restituted in 1947 through the French government to the Wildensteins, and they sell to one of their best clients, Florence Gould, American-born French collector, patron of the Met, very prominent collector like Comtesse de Grefful, also had a salon before the war in Paris, and then moved later on to Cannes in the south. Her collection comes on the market a few years after her death at Sotheby's in New York in 1985. And at that time, this is before the Washington Principles, none of this previous information matters. It's just a beautiful picture. It's a records auction, sets all records for individual artists, but also as a single owner sale. And the work starts to lead its own life until it comes back at auction not too long ago in 2012 at Christie's in New York. And since then, a lot has changed in terms of provenance. It's no longer enough to just have the painting and do an art loss register search. One needs to get into earlier provenance more than before during the previous sale. So Christie's did I can't take credit for any of this information. Christie's did a very thorough research, and that's most of it is printed in their auction catalog. And I don't know, Tom, if you wanted to show the slides of the Germans. This is of course not part of the Christie's auction catalog, but this is the German, and this is a little bit devil's advocate, but this is what great provenance record keeping should look like. These are entry records from the Germans after their confiscation in Paris. And I mean, it's more than these pages, but it has photos. It has a photo of the frame. It shows exactly where it was confiscated, in which bank vault, in which bank in Paris, when it was transferred a second time, and where it was retrieved again. This is unfortunately how almost nobody, including museums, keep record keeping, or not at the time. This is really the only way to trace back existence of previous owners and how things were restituted after the war because of good record keeping. I'm not saying anything positive about confiscations, but about the importance of keeping good records with images.
I'm certainly keen to hear later how in your work, Mireille, and indeed with the others on the panel, you might help contribute to the collection and the dissemination and the passing on of this information as it becomes available with a collection. I think that's a really interesting subject for us to come back to. I'm going to move on to finally, last but not least, to Petra's slides, please.
Thank you. So this is an oil sketch by Constable dated 1824. It is, well, it has an interesting history. It was the subject of a restitution claim a few years ago. I was fortunate to act in the legal team that represented the claimants, who were the heirs of a very prominent Hungarian Jewish collector who purchased this painting in 1908 in Paris and then had it in his collection till 1944 when it was looted following the German invasion of Hungary. It then wound its way into the art market and back to the UK by the 1960s when it was purchased by a private individual from a dealer and then gifted to the Tate in the 1980s. So it hung on the walls of the Tate for a long time and then was the subject of a restitution claim made before the Spoliation Advisory Panel. I won't go into any of the details of the moral or legal claims, but essentially the panel recommended that the painting be restituted to the claimants and also made some interesting observations about the fact that a number of opportunities were missed to do due diligence on the painting and to fill in the provenance gaps while it was with the Tate, because there was this gap in the Tate cataloguing from 1908 to the 1960s, over 50 years, in which its whereabouts were unknown. That there was no information about the owner. Of course, it was for most of that time in the hands of a very prominent collector, and it was published, and there were things known about it, but it just didn't make its way to the Tate's knowledge. So it's a good example of a very obvious provenance gap, spanning quite a very key period in history, obviously spanning the Nazi era. And it's also, I suppose, on the sort of more positive side of things, although the painting was restituted to the claimants and then had to be sold at auction a little while later. And so when it was sold at auction, it did have the full provenance information, including that it had been looted and then restituted. So I think, in that sense, that the claimants had some closure, and whoever the current owner of the work is has some peace of mind about the fact that the title issues have been resolved. So I think that is a benefit.
Well, thank you very much for all of those slides. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I wanted to pick up on many of the things that those case studies have brought up. First of all, let me ask you, Chris, as the collector in the Zoom room, as it were, when you started collecting, did you think about how your objects, the objects you're acquiring, might have this type of afterlife in your collection, or did you think that everything was fixed as you were acquiring it?
Well, certainly probably for the first, let's say, 7 to 10 years that I was collecting, let's say I'm 50 now, from the age of, let's say, 25 to 34, 35 years old, I didn't really give any sort of research or didn't really sort of look at the provenance particularly of things. And I think that 90% of people that start collections, you know, that are buying to decorate their houses, that wander into an art fair, buy a painting, maybe buy an antiquity, you know, very much think like that. And I think the reason for that is not that you're not being careful, but if you buy something at an art fair or you buy something at public auction, you tend to feel like you're buying with confidence. You don't tend to think that I should be asking the dealer or going through some enormous amount of paperwork and doing due diligence to figure out whether or not they're selling me something that's been stolen. So it wasn't until I'd been sort of collecting for about 10 years, I guess, and became a more professional collector, and then started to sort of, you know, the collections were getting bigger, and then I sort of became more aware. And then, of course, particularly in antiquities, I mean, I didn't start collecting antiquities till 2003, so I was about 33 then. And it actually wasn't until I opened the museum in 2011 that that really I was sort of getting more enlightened as to what had gone on in the antiquities market over the last sort of 50 years. And even then, I was sort of finding some of the situations quite hard to believe, and until we were sort of facing a whole bunch of different things from to do with provenance issues and actually in a much smaller way, even forgeries. Forgeries aren't so much the problem in antiquities. I mean, they definitely happen, but it's provenance that's the major issue. And actually, for the last 5 or 6 years, we've actually dealt with a whole number of different provenance issues, and that's why I basically don't buy antiquities anymore at all. I bought one antiquity in the last 4 years, and that was the one that I bought in 2017 that we talked about just before this call. But now we are due diligence experts, I assure you, way ahead of most organizations by a long way.
I think, or I like to think, that you use the phrase just now, which is before I became a professional collector. And this idea that collecting might be, or properly managing a collection might be almost a profession in itself and a full-time job. And indeed, collection management as an expression is something that brings the language of business into the world of what we might consider pleasure, leisure, aesthetics, and the preservation of cultural heritage. And I wondered if we can just pick up on that point. I was going to ask, perhaps we'll start by asking Petra, if that's okay. We'll talk about this idea of what collection management for you from a legal perspective might involve. How would you define what it even is?
Well, I think collection management really revolves around record keeping, like Mireille was talking about, and obviously gave that example of that incredible record keeping. And so that's really it in its basic sense. It's having a good record, having documentation about the works in the collection, you know, with photographs, with any provenance information that there is, and continuing to build on what you know about the objects in the collection and keeping that all together.
Amelie, is there anything that you might add from the position of your work with the Art Loss Register?
I think, as Petra and Mireille have said, record keeping is essentially really absolutely crucial. The work that we do, unfortunately, quite often kicks in when something was stolen, and then it is just too late to get those records together. So I would add, I think it's fairly obvious, but sometimes apparently it isn't. Don't keep records like receipts on the actual artworks, but keep them separate from them. And ideally keep records digitally in some way. We at the Art Loss Register work with larger collections as well, who preemptively register their collections with us so that we can alert them when something pops up on the market, and they can double check, should this actually still be in their collection, and has it been stolen without them even realizing it. So, and in a way, the ALR quite often ends up being an archive for records maintained by collectors and also by insurers on things they pay out. And that's really crucial, because unfortunately, when artworks are stolen, it can quite often take a very long time for them to reappear.
I was very interested that Chris mentioned, I think it was Chris mentioned the possibility that people might be just buying things. And of course, antiquities in particular, as well as other fields, are fields that appeal perhaps to people who might want certain objects. They might want one antiquity to complete an interior, or to juxtapose with other types of works. And I wonder whether you think, Amelie, that type of collecting, that obviously it's a very valid type of collecting to acquire works, but is a bit more risky looking forwards, as to whether these type of the objects moving into parts of an interior decoration space, you start to lose some of the record keeping in that mode of collecting.
Well, yes, you start, I mean, you can of course document something in your room, and some of the records that we have actually also from works that were taken by the Nazis just show a living room with the works in situ, and that's a really good piece of evidence that something once belonged to you. So I would recommend even doing that sort of record keeping. The crucial thing is that you have those records when the work is actually gone. Now, of course, antiquities, as Chris has painfully experienced, are a particularly sort of dangerous field to collect. And if you don't know the market well, that's really an area where you have to rely on the dealers, on the trade, to conduct a lot of due diligence. But it's absolutely crucial that you, even if you buy them for the first time, ask a lot of questions in this field.
Let's pass the ball to Mireille. And Mireille, I wondered if in your work, obviously you've worked with a lot of private collectors as well as institutional collections. How much have you felt working with particular collectors that part of your role is to impress upon them the importance of research and record keeping, not only the work you've done, but helping them out in the future with their collections?
Truthfully, that becomes only very important. It's also very costly because it's so time consuming. Once a collector like Chris has dealt with restitution, it's usually a process of 10 plus years, and it involves litigation. And I think Chris's situation is very rare of someone to just hand over objects in I guess a very altruistic point, or maybe he has great title insurance, I don't know. But it usually becomes something, or if someone is about to donate works to a museum or starts their own museum, or there are international loans involved where it's not entirely clear what the country's position is on confiscation, for instance. But until then, like I believe Chris said, people feel confident when they buy something at a public auction or at a fair such as TEFAF, where things are vetted and proved by our Los Register. People feel confident that there shouldn't be a problem, and that the dealers and sources they buy from did their due diligence. That said, I don't know, over 100,000 works are unaccounted for. I think our Los Registers database, there are 700,000 works listed. I don't know what they look like, if they're like 30 teacups from the same service, but those are staggering numbers. So in a way, collectors shouldn't be too focused on these problems, because nothing would change hands, and museums shouldn't even have websites up and show anything, because there are problems in museums too.
Sorry, can I just clarify what you think that museums ought not to show?
Since the 1998, since the Washington Principles, 44 countries have agreed to doing thorough provenance research in their public collections, and most museums in each country have done so. But it's only the tip of the iceberg. Most museums started with the period 1940-45. Then 10 years later, when everyone figured out that the Washington Principles were great but non-binding, they added period 1933, 1938. And as you will see if you read the art newspaper on a regular basis, claiming a work of art from a public institution is not an easy thing, and you need to have very deep pockets. So it's easy to look at the art market for, it's almost like handling looted art, whereas the majority is already in museums or is still in German and Dutch museums. So I feel like it's the art market could rectify this problem, but it's a little bit unfair to only look at the art market. I think the problem should be addressed in an maybe not in a moral way, but in a more legal way. But we have lawyers here to address them.
I want to think about the distinctions for collectors specifically about what might be moral duties or felt as such, and what might be legal responsibilities. So let's move on to that. Petra, I mean, with the collectors that you have perhaps, and collections you've perhaps worked with, I mean, could you draw out some of those differences? How far you feel that private collectors feel a moral responsibility to do this work, and when they might have a legal obligation to do something about things that they own?
Yes, sure. Well, I think collectors come in all varieties, I imagine, so I don't think there's really, I couldn't generalize about when, which ones might feel a moral obligation. Obviously, we've seen Chris's example of returning objects to Spain, and that's an incredible example, and I don't imagine that a lot of collectors are jumping to do that. But there's going to be a range, and there are a lot of collectors who just collect very privately, and that their objects will never see the light of day, really. They're in their homes or in storage, and in those kinds of collections, I mean, really, who knows what's what issues you might discover if you were to look through those objects. And because you can purchase things and you don't necessarily know where they've come from or whether there's any title or authenticity issues or otherwise. And it's really when I think there's certain moments that these issues tend to crystallize, and that's usually when they come into the public domain somehow, and it's either on buying or selling an artwork, or on lending it to an exhibition, or traveling, in which case you need an export license and you have to give details of provenance for that. And so, or if you're trying to, put up collateral for a loan, that's when those questions will be asked. And so, and you have to, as the collector, the owner of the works, you will have to show that you've got good title and demonstrate why that's the case and have documentation to back it up. So if you haven't done your due diligence at that point, that's really when you run into issues, legal issues.
So in a sense, it's when you want to somehow, for want of a better word, activate something in your collection by putting it in a museum display, by taking out financing against it. Chris, did you get your money back for your helmet?
Well, I'm in a sort of legal situation right now, trying to get my money back from the auction house in Germany, and the owners as well that sold me the helmets. So I can't really talk about that too much. I certainly don't have it back today, but I hope to have it back within the next 12 months. Yeah. But just picking up on a couple of sort of points that were made there. First of all, the paperwork sort of idea, you know, it's absolutely crucial to get as much paperwork as you can, no gaps in it, etc., etc. So obviously everybody agrees with that. But the problem is, and which happens in my experience, really mainly in the antiquities area, is that if that paperwork is a forgery, but it looks correct, you know, you're no better off with that paperwork until you find that out at some later stage. And then you know you've got a problem. And actually that's happened to us on a number of occasions. You know, there's collections out there which are purely invented collections. There's been original documents that have then been photocopied out and applied to the same piece, or sorry, applied to different pieces, but they originally were only applied to one piece, but now they've been applied to 10 different pieces. All sorts of sort of different antics, or things which were clearly looted, and you know, then the provenance was altered. False affidavits referencing collections. I knew this person back in 1978, and that person's been, you know, is a real person. They did know that person back in 1978, but they've been paid to write that document. I mean, that really, you know, those kind of situations do tend to be more specific to the antiquities market, I have to say, which over the years has clearly been a particular cesspit. But the way to protect yourself in antiquities, really, and this is really polarizing the pricing of antiquities, is to buy things that have been published prior to 1970, or even better, prior to about 1920, 1930. Because the UNESCO Convention protects you to some degree, which is a 1970 sort of guideline, which says you shouldn't buy an antiquity without paperwork prior to 1970. But that still doesn't protect you from a restitution claim that might come from the 1930s or 1940s, for example, because many of these Mediterranean countries brought in laws somewhere between about 1915 and about 1950 to say that if something's dug up in our country, it belongs to us. So you really, to be absolutely bulletproof, if something's been published in the early 1900s or before, notwithstanding the Nazi situation, then you've got something which is really, really valuable. The provenance is perfect, and the price of that particular piece will multiply as time goes on, because the pieces of more limited provenance, which is the majority of the market, are getting harder and harder to move into country. Customs are looking at them more. They're getting harder to sell at the auction houses. You know, Sotheby's want pre-1970 provenance. Christie's want pre-2000 documentation. Bonhams is going in that direction as well. You know, so you know, buy from the auction houses. They're doing better due diligence these days. And if you want something that's absolutely bulletproof and you're buying from a dealer, look for early 20th century published provenance. But you know, but then looking at the modern art market, I mean, it's been well reported that the Knoedler Gallery, you know, sold several tens of millions of dollars worth of artworks, 10, 15 years ago. You know, they were the oldest gallery in America, dating back to the 19th century. And they were the victim, it seems, or they would argue they were the victim, I guess, of forged paperwork relating to a collection, and they were selling these artworks, and they were experts. So, you know, one has to be careful. But the one thing that does protect you is buying something that's been published. You can't forge a book from 1946 or 1965 or 1830. So, you know, that's one good way to protect yourself. And I don't want to make it look like everybody's selling forgeries or looted stuff. That's not the case. It's rare. But, you know, while we're on the subject of extreme due diligence and paperwork, I would just say that.
Let's just move the discussion on to think about something that is perhaps more imaginative and less about the paper trails and so on. But Mireille, it seemed that the example you brought with the Moreau had the suggestion of actually how the work one does on provenance, aside from the price or perceived and actual value of the work, adds somehow in terms of, it's quite a romantic notion with a capital R, this idea of of the story of an artwork and how it's moved through different collections. Is that something in the fields you deal in which you find collectors have a particular penchant for?
It depends on the collector. I think for majority of collectors, they would buy an object because they really like it, and the provenance is maybe secondary unless that's something they're always doing their due diligence. I think for museums, it's absolutely key. This would be a prime example of a full provenance that nobody needs to worry about, and prominent provenance, and an interesting story to tell. So I think it would hit beyond buying an arguably very excellent artwork. It would have an extra cachet, and you see that in the art market. When restituted works of art from museums come to market, it's very often through public auction because there are more parties involved, and it will almost always bring a higher, realize a higher price than if it didn't have that provenance. And it's not just a provenance, it's of course also that museum quality pictures don't come often on the market unless they were restituted. Very few museums deaccession, and when they deaccession, it's usually because it's not museum quality. So it's that factor too. It's hard to distinguish how much a perfect provenance adds to a value. I would say in terms of like early 20th century sculpture, provenance does matter because it will be the only way to know if something is really authentic or a later cast or a later version. So in those cases, I think provenance definitely adds value to a work of art.
For me, the idea of collection management.
But now I'm worried by Chris' story that all those documents are forgeries.
For me, the idea of collection management includes all those other things one might do, and which are related to gathering information about it, but they might involve publishing it, displaying it, conserving it, and these things that may interleave with the knowledge we have about the object. I wondered, thinking about that particular point, and perhaps I'll ask Petra about this, in terms of collections, both private individuals and corporate, that moment of bringing information before the public or bringing works before the public, which you already defined as a possible point where the moral possibility becomes a legal reality. Have you found that brings more risks, more benefits, or a mixture of both? It's just a process of collecting that perhaps you find out things you didn't want to know about the things you own.
Right, true. I mean, yes. I mean, the collectors who are, the private collectors who are generous enough to, open their collection to the public and to publish it and exhibit it, and obviously, I mean, gain benefits from the exposure, I'm sure, and building a reputation and building the reputation of the work through that. But then obviously, it invites greater scrutiny. So then you get people questioning, popping up with potential ownership claims or questioning the authenticity of something. You get experts, convening to think about what is it actually authentic. So there are potential problems that might arise. I mean, I would have thought it's better to get these things out in the open, because I imagine as a collector, your appreciation of something is greater if you know that it is what it is supposed to be and what it says it is, and and that scholars can agree on it being the real thing, and that it has a good ownership history, and you can rely on that. So, but I suppose, I mean, there are risks with bringing things out into the world. So,
hey, it might be worth more too.
Yes.
Amelie, is this something with the Art Loss Register? Do you find that's quite a frequent case, that things that people are bringing out into the open as if they've been remained hidden before for the first time are the points where they're really investigated and that you make a match with your register?
Yeah, That's absolutely the case. I mean, in some cases, we make the match when something comes to the market again. In some cases, we make the match when it goes on an exhibition loan. But there are also cases where before that happens, the collectors actually want to mitigate that risk and actually proactively search something with us themselves before looking at lending it. And there are instruments like immunity from seizure, for example, if you want to lend something across borders, that collectors can and should make use of, but that usually requires some due diligence on your end. And we quite often, and more, I should say, see this proactive risk mitigation before something goes public from private collectors, and also a lot from corporate collections.
I have lots of questions that I want to ask, but I did promise that we would look at some questions that might come in or have come in from some of the people who are listening to us. So I've got the chat box open, and I'm going to try to take a few. And if people who are watching would like to ask further questions, please do fire them in the next minute or so. I take this question, which is from someone watching, who asks, besides record keeping, what advice would you give to buyers, either private or institutional, to avoid falling into the trap of buyers' overconfidence? Let's Amelie, you're nodding. Do you have an answer?
Well, I think the other really crucial thing is when you buy something, ask questions. No matter where you buy, ask about the provenance, ask about any documentation, if there is any, ask about publications. Look at these catalogs that the auction houses and the dealers put together with a great amount of work. And then also, I mean, some recent litigation has shown that it can help to simply do a quick Google search yourself before you buy something, if you want to know, for example, whether it was up for auction recently or something like that.
Chris?
Well, I'm not sure if the person that's asking the question is asking, you know, how can I stop myself from being impetuous? There's also sort of alluding to that in the question. My answer to that would be that if you see something that you think is absolutely amazing and you're feeling that you want to buy it in 20 seconds, always ask the dealer, if it's with a dealer, to just reserve it for you for 4 or 5 days. They'll always have no problem with that, unless they've got someone else that's thinking about it at that second. And then that gives you just a little bit of breathing space to sit back, go back and look at it again, do some due diligence on it, and have a think about, you know, whether you really want it, whether you really want to spend the money, you know, etc., etc. If it's at an auction house, you know, same thing. Go and see it early during the viewing period. You know, go back and see it. Take a few days to think about it. Go through the auction catalogue. Go onto ArtNet or ArtPrice. Look up prior auction records. See how the paintings are selling. See if it's kind of the right price. Go onto Artsy, have a look around the market, see where the pieces are trading there, see if there's a better piece by that artist and a better date on the market, and you know, do that kind of sort of due diligence as well. That's not easy to do at an art fair, because you can't reserve something at an art fair generally, because someone might come along and 5 minutes later and buy it off the dealer. But just take a little bit of time, try and see it early, and have a bit of a think about it.
Mireille, let me just ask you quickly, do you ever find potential clients, and not in any nefarious way, but actually bringing you new information about works that you have, that for whatever reason you had not dug up?
Absolutely. I have limited access. One of my specialties is Dutch and Belgium turn of the century material, and I have limited access here to exhibition catalogs and obscure publications, and I will have colleagues that will send me information of previous exhibitions that I really wouldn't even know where to look for. Coming from privates, it's a little bit less, but it's mostly colleagues. But I would also like to add that don't rely too much on your own research on Google and ArtNet and databases, because you could also fall for the pitfall that something has been wrongly attributed, and that happens at auction too, and it starts to live its own life. Ask experts, ask, most museums have, curators are super generous with their time. You can, at an art fair, you can ask other dealers. In general, people are, if you're interested, people are so eager to share their knowledge, information, and including auction houses, and just keep asking questions. And don't rely too much on Google, I would say. That could be problematic. It could give false confidence.
Well, if it's difficult to forge a book from 1832, it's not very hard to put up a website and to let that digital trail continue making.
Finding early publications on Google is not so easy.
Here's a question which I'm going to ask the lawyer on our panel, Petra, which is a question about that there may be certain examples of the illicit nature of the market, which might suggest that sometimes collectors and museums are naive to assume that they have all the information in front of them. And the question that we've got here is whether there should be more ethical but even legal responsibility on the part of buyers to know, to have more information about what they're buying.
I don't know, that's quite a difficult one. I think, I mean, you know, there's all sorts of buyers, and you can't, you know, there's a whole range of levels of experience. And I think, I mean, there's really not really any case law in this area, but I imagine if there was, I'm sure, you know, you'd look at sort of the experience of the buyer and decide, you know, are they a sort of professional collector, or is this a new thing that they're setting out on, and how, you know, how much can they really be expected to do in terms of due diligence and to know. I think it's really, it would be very difficult to put sort of the onus completely on the buyer to do it. But then there is, yes, sorry.
In some sense, you'd be saying you'd be looking for a way to either criticize or prosecute someone for buying in bad faith, and how you would prove that buying in bad faith was something that could happen. Perhaps it's just a hypothetical experiment to make us think more about our caution when we approach this. Chris, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, it's the only time that the buyer could possibly be responsible for acting in bad faith, in my opinion, is if they know that the piece that they're buying is looted, or that there's a problem with it when they buy it, and they just don't care. And that, while I've seen that in the past, that is excessively rare, that a buyer just cannot help themselves. They have to own that piece, even though they know it's, you know, and I've only ever seen it in Antiquities, that they have to own that piece at all costs, even though they know they're buying something that's stolen. Clearly then they are aggravating that market and encouraging looting, smuggling, and then sales fraud, which is basically the chain of selling a looted antiquity. But I mean, you know, the amount of people that have done that over the years, you certainly buying things publicly rather than sort of non-publicly, you know, I mean, there's very few. You could probably sort of count them on one or two hands. Otherwise, I think the buyer is completely innocent in all other cases, because the dealer who's selling it to you is the expert. You know, an auction house has a team of lawyers behind them. They have a team of due diligence people, a team of researchers. When you buy from an auction house, you buy with confidence. But Mireille is absolutely right. They've not only made, you know, mistakes in antiquities in the past, you know, attribution in old masters has been a hugely difficult area. And that can be the difference between a painting being worth, you know, $300,000 or $30 million, depending on how much studio participation there's been in a picture, even if they've got the correct studio for it. You know, if it was 100% painted by Botticelli as it was painted for a particular family, and it's a documented piece, and only he touched it. It's a $30 million painting. If it's been heavily over-attributed and he barely touched it at all, it's a $300,000 painting, if that. It might only be a $30,000 or $40,000 painting. So, you know, I think one thing from all these pitfalls, and certainly Old Masters is an extremely tricky area as well. And actually, not only are they tricky areas from a sort of provenance and attribution perspective, but talking in terms of collection management, you know, Old Masters on panel are difficult things to look after, as are often antiquities that are made from metal. So they, you know, require exactly the right kind of room temperatures, humidity, and you know, really over time require, you know, often sort of correct conservation. And I think that certainly in my case, I've collected in both those areas, that's driven me to the post-war market. You know, you don't have to worry about Nazi looting. You don't have to worry about conservation, generally speaking. You don't have to worry about attribution. It's not that there isn't forgeries in the post-war market, but generally the market and the auction houses have done a much better job in recent years of getting the provenance back to the artists, so they don't sell anything with provenance gaps. And that really has driven me to really only buying sort of mid 20th century pictures and later. I'm just sick of the issues in Old Masters and antiquities. That's not to say don't collect them, it's just to say you've got to be careful.
At this point, we would usually stop and continue the conversation over, if we were lucky, a glass of champagne, and if we were unlucky, a glass of lukewarm white wine. But I'm afraid we have run out of time. Chris, you said in your last part, I think the buyer is innocent, and I want to translate that into the collector is always innocent, and leave that as perhaps something for people to mull around on their minds this evening
while they're visiting London Art Week.
So the last thing to say is a big thank you to Amelie Ebbinghaus, Mireille Mosler, Petra Warrington and Christian Levette, and finally, please do visit London Art Week, either in person if you're able to, or online. It continues until Friday. And have a very good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.